On August 18, 1965, 5,500 United States Marines launched the first major American offensive operation of the Vietnam War. They had 48 hours to surround and destroy an entire Viet Cong regiment that intelligence said was preparing to overrun the American airbase at Chu Lai. The plan was textbook Marine Corps doctrine: helicopter assault from above, amphibious landing from the sea, ground forces moving in from the west. 3 arms of a vice closing simultaneously on an enemy force that supposedly didn't know the Americans were coming. It should have been a clean victory, a demonstration of American military superiority that would show the Viet Cong what happened when they faced professional soldiers backed by helicopters, naval gunfire, and overwhelming firepower. Instead, Operation Starlite became a brutal education in exactly how difficult this war was going to be. Because the Viet Cong weren't surprised, they were waiting, and they'd prepared a reception that would kill 45 Marines and wound over 200 more in just 6 days of fighting. But here's what made Starlite significant beyond the casualty numbers. It worked. The Marines broke the VC 1st Regiment as an effective fighting force, inflicted over 600 confirmed kills, and achieved their objective. It was America's first real victory in Vietnam, and the lessons learned, both good and bad, would shape how the United States fought for the next 8 years. Now, before we get into the operation itself, we need to understand how the United States went from military advisors to combat units in the first place, because Operation Starlite didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the direct result of decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington by people who thought they understood what was happening in Vietnam but really didn't. The story starts in March 1965 when the first US combat troops landed at Da Nang, 2 Marine battalions, roughly 3,500 men sent to protect the American airbase there from Viet Cong attacks. Their official mission was defensive: protect the base, patrol the immediate area, but don't go looking for fights. This was called the enclave strategy, and it frustrated the hell out of Marine commanders who believed that sitting in defensive positions was exactly the wrong way to fight the Viet Cong. The Marine Corps had built its reputation on aggressive offensive action, maneuver warfare, taking the fight to the enemy. Sitting behind wire watching the enemy operate freely in the countryside went against every instinct they had. General William Westmoreland, commander of US forces in Vietnam, agreed with the Marines. He wanted to take the war to the enemy, find their main force units, fix them in place, and destroy them with superior American firepower. But President Lyndon Johnson and his advisors were nervous about escalation. They were afraid that aggressive American ground operations might provoke China or the Soviet Union into direct intervention, turning Vietnam into another Korea, or worse. So the enclave strategy stayed in place through the spring of 1965, even as more American units arrived in country. By summer, roughly 75,000 American troops were in Vietnam, most of them Marines in the northern provinces. The 3rd Marine Amphibious Force under General Lewis Walt controlled everything from Da Nang north to the DMZ, and they were getting more aggressive whether Washington liked it or not. Small unit patrols pushed further from the bases. Company-sized operations went after specific VC targets. The Marines were testing the boundaries of their defensive mission, looking for opportunities to go on the offensive. The Chu Lai Air Base sat on the coast about 55 miles south of Da Nang. It had been carved out of rice paddies and sand dunes starting in May 1965 to provide another airfield for Marine aircraft and to extend American control further south along the coast. By August, Chu Lai hosted Marine fighter bombers, helicopters, and supporting units. It was also vulnerable. The base sat in an area the Viet Cong had controlled for years. Local villagers supported the VC either willingly or because they had no choice. VC units moved freely through the area at night and increasingly during the day. Intelligence indicated that Viet Cong forces were building up in the hills southwest of Chu Lai, possibly preparing for an attack on the base itself. The intelligence came from multiple sources. Radio intercepts suggested unusual VC activity. Local Vietnamese informants reported large numbers of VC soldiers moving into the area. Marine patrols made contact with what appeared to be battalion-sized or larger VC units, operating about 10 miles from Chu Lai. By early August, Marine intelligence officers had identified the enemy force as the 1st Viet Cong Regiment, a main force unit with roughly 2,000 fighters organised into 3 battalions. The 60th, 80th and 52nd battalions were all in the area, concentrated in a cluster of villages on the Tuong Peninsula, about 12 miles south of Chu Lai. The Tuong Peninsula was perfect terrain for the Viet Cong, a patchwork of rice paddies, small villages, hedgerows, and hills covered with scrub brush. The villages had been VC territory since the war against the French. The population was either sympathetic to the Viet Cong or too intimidated to resist them. The VC had built extensive fortifications over the years, spider holes for snipers, bunker complexes with interlocking fields of fire, tunnel systems for moving between positions without being seen, trenches connecting key points. It was a miniature fortress that the VC knew intimately, and the Americans had never even seen. Colonel Oscar Petros, commanding the 7th Marine Regiment, took the intelligence to General Walt and proposed what would become Operation Starlite. The concept was aggressive and risky. Instead of waiting for the VC to attack Chu Lai, the Marines would hit the VC 1st Regiment first, surround them, cut off their escape routes, and destroy them in place using combined helicopter assault, amphibious landing and ground attack. It would be the first regimental-sized heliborne assault in Marine Corps history, and if it worked, it would eliminate a major VC threat and show that American forces could find, fix, and destroy main force VC units. General Walt approved the plan on August 16th. The operation would launch in 2 days. That gave the Marines 48 hours to coordinate 3 separate assault forces, brief the units, load equipment, and move into position without tipping off the VC that something big was coming. The short timeline was deliberate. The longer the Marines waited, the more likely it was that VC spies would learn about the operation and warn the regiment. Speed and surprise were essential. The plan divided the assault into 3 phases and 3 separate landing zones. Phase 1 would begin at dawn on August 18th with an amphibious landing on the coast east of the Tuong villages. This force, built around the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, would come ashore from ships offshore, move inland, and block the VC's escape route to the east. Phase 2 would launch simultaneously as helicopter-borne Marines from the 3rd Battalion. 3rd Marines landed at multiple zones west and south of the villages, blocking escape routes in those directions. Phase 3 would have the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines moving overland from Chu Lai to close the vice from the north. The VC 1st Regiment would be trapped in a box with Marines on all sides. Artillery and naval gunfire would pound any VC positions that resisted. Airstrikes would hit anything that moved, and if the VC tried to fight their way out, they'd run straight into prepared Marine positions with interlocking fields of fire. On paper, it was textbook. In reality, it was about to become significantly more complicated. At 0630 hours on August 18th, 1965, Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines hit Green Beach on the coast in amphibious tractors, or Amtraks, churning through the surf and up onto the sand. This was the amphibious assault force, coming ashore just like their fathers and grandfathers had done at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima. Except instead of facing Japanese machine guns on the beach, they landed unopposed. The beach was empty, no enemy fire, no resistance. The Amtraks ground up the sand, lowered their ramps, and Marines poured out into the early morning heat, spreading into assault formations and moving inland toward the villages. The lack of opposition should have been a warning. The VC knew the Americans were coming. They'd pulled back from the beach into prepared positions inland where the terrain favoured them, and where American firepower would be less effective. The question was whether the Marines would realise this before they walked into the trap. While the amphibious force moved inland, 12 Marine helicopters lifted off from Chu Lai carrying India Company and part of Mike Company from the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. The helicopters flew low and fast over the rice paddies, heading for Landing Zone Blue northwest of the target villages. This was the heliborne assault, and it was supposed to catch the VC by surprise, dropping Marines behind their positions before they realised what was happening. The lead helicopters touched down at Landing Zone Blue at 0645, just 15 minutes after the beach landing. The doors slid open, and Marines jumped out into knee-deep rice paddy water, spreading out as the helicopters lifted off to bring in more troops. And that's when the VC opened fire. Machine guns from concealed positions raked the landing zone. Mortars started dropping rounds among the Marines spread out in the open paddy. The VC had known exactly where the Americans would land, and had prepared positions with clear fields of fire across the entire LZ. India Company took casualties immediately. Marines went down in the water hit by machine gun fire. Others dove behind rice paddy dikes that provided cover but no concealment. The helicopters taking off took hits, with at least one forced to make an emergency landing. The Marines on the ground were pinned, unable to advance across open ground swept by automatic weapons fire. Captain Bruce Webb, commanding India Company, realised within minutes that his company had landed in a kill zone. The VC weren't running, they were fighting from prepared positions, and they had the advantage of terrain and surprise despite the Americans supposedly being the ones conducting the surprise attack. Webb called for fire support. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore started pounding suspected VC positions. Artillery from Chu Lai joined in. Marine fighter bombers screamed overhead, dropping bombs and napalm on tree lines where the VC fire was coming from. But the VC positions were well-constructed bunkers and spider holes that could survive near misses, and the Marines were too close for the supporting arms to hit the VC without risking friendly casualties. India Company was stuck. They couldn't advance, they couldn't retreat. All they could do was return fire and wait for reinforcements. The Marines spread across the landing zone formed small defensive positions behind whatever cover they could find, rice paddy dikes mostly, and started the process of locating enemy positions and systematically destroying them with rifle fire, grenades and machine guns. It was slow, brutal work under constant fire, and it was nothing like what the operation plan had anticipated. At the beach landing zone, the 3rd Battalion, 7th, the Marines moved inland without significant contact at first. They advanced through the coastal villages, clearing hoochies and checking for VC. The villagers had mostly fled. The few who remained claimed to know nothing about Viet Cong soldiers in the area, which the Marines didn't believe but couldn't disprove. As the battalion pushed deeper inland toward the main village complex, the terrain changed from open sand and sparse vegetation to dense hedgerows, tree lines, and built-up areas where visibility dropped to meters instead of hundreds of meters. This was where the VC wanted to fight. Close terrain where American firepower advantages meant less, and where small unit tactics and knowledge of the ground mattered more. Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, moving overland from Chu Lai to complete the encirclement from the north, ran into heavy resistance almost immediately. The VC had positioned forces to block exactly this approach, knowing it was the obvious route for American reinforcements. What should have been a simple movement to contact turned into a running firefight through rice paddies and villages. Hotel Company took casualties and slowed down, which meant the northern arm of the encirclement wasn't closing as fast as planned. The VC were already adapting to the American operation, shifting forces, reinforcing positions under pressure, and looking for weak points in the Marine lines. By mid-morning on the first day, the operation had already deviated significantly from the plan. India Company at Landing Zone Blue was pinned and taking casualties. The amphibious force moving inland from the beach was advancing slowly through increasingly heavy resistance. Hotel Company moving from the north was bogged down in a firefight. The encirclement that was supposed to trap the VC 1st Regiment had gaps in it, and the VC, rather than being surprised and surrounded, were fighting from prepared positions with clear knowledge of American movements and intentions. What happened over the next 6 days would determine whether Operation Starlite became a victory or a disaster, and the outcome would depend less on the overall plan and more on small unit actions, individual Marines making split-second decisions under fire, and the ability of junior officers and NCOs to adapt when the textbook solution stopped working. Wasn't. Let me tell you about some of those men and what they did when everything started going wrong. Corporal Robert O'Malley was a 21-year-old squad leader with India Company. When his company landed at LZ Blue and came under immediate fire, O'Malley's squad was among those pinned in the rice paddy. He watched Marines around him get hit, saw his company commander trying to organise a response under fire, and made a decision that would earn him the Medal of Honour. O'Malley saw that the VC machine gun fire was coming from a fortified position about 50 metres away, concealed in a tree line. The gun had a clear field of fire across the entire landing zone. As long as it kept firing, Marines couldn't manoeuvre. They were stuck, so O'Malley grabbed his rifle and ran straight at the position. He covered the 50 metres across open ground, while the VC machine gun and several rifles fired at him. Somehow none of the rounds hit him. When he reached the tree line, he killed 3 VC, soldiers with rifle fire, then moved on the bunker itself. He killed the machine gun crew with grenades, then turned and waved his squad forward. The destruction of that position allowed India Company to finally start moving, breaking the pin that had held them. O'Malley would continue fighting throughout the day, destroying multiple enemy positions and leading his squad through some of the heaviest combat of the operation. He survived Starlite and later said he didn't remember making the decision to charge the machine gun position. He just remembered seeing what needed to be done and doing it. Lieutenant Homer Jenkins commanded a platoon in Mike Company that landed at LZ Blue shortly after India Company. His platoon came under heavy fire while still in the landing zone. Jenkins organised his Marines into assault teams and began systematically clearing VC positions one by one. When one of his squads became isolated and cut off by VC forces, Jenkins led a relief force to reach them, fighting through multiple enemy positions. He was hit twice by rifle fire but refused evacuation and continued leading his platoon. Over the course of the day, Jenkins and his Marines would kill an estimated 40 VC soldiers and destroy numerous fortified positions. Jenkins would eventually be evacuated after being wounded a third time, but his platoon's actions helped secure the landing zone and allowed follow-on forces to land safely. Back at the amphibious landing site, Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines was advancing through the village of Quang 1 when they walked into an L-shaped ambush. The VC had positioned forces in hedgerows and buildings on two sides of the company's line of march. When Echo Company entered the kill zone, the VC opened fire from three sides simultaneously. Machine guns, rifles and recoilless rifles all firing at once. Marines went down all along the column. The company commander was hit. The executive officer took over and was hit moments later. For several minutes, Echo Company was leaderless, taking fire from multiple directions, with casualties piling up and no clear way out of the ambush. Staff Sergeant Ed Garner, a platoon sergeant who'd fought in Korea, took charge. He organised the Marines nearest him into a defensive perimeter, got casualties pulled into cover, and started identifying enemy positions. Then he began calling in artillery fire, walking the rounds closer and closer to his own position to suppress the VC firing from the hedgerows. When the artillery shifted the VC fire enough to give him an opening, Garner led a counterattack straight into the enemy positions. His Marines assaulted through the hedgerows with grenades and rifle fire, killing VC soldiers in close combat and breaking the ambush. Garner's actions saved Echo Company from being overrun and allowed them to reorganise and continue the mission. He was recommended for the Navy Cross. By the end of the first day, August 18th, the Marines had taken 43 casualties, killed and wounded. They'd also killed an estimated 150 VC soldiers, destroyed numerous fortified positions, and established footholds in and around the target villages. But the VC 1st Regiment was still intact, still fighting, and still very much in the battle. The encirclement wasn't complete. The VC had escape routes to the west and south that weren't fully blocked, and intelligence was starting to indicate that the VC might be reinforcing rather than withdrawing, bringing in additional forces to turn the battle into a larger confrontation. The second day, August 19th, saw the heaviest fighting of the operation. The Marines tightened the noose around the remaining VC positions, clearing villages building by building, bunker by bunker. This was brutal, close-quarters combat in terrain that favoured the defenders. Every building could hide VC soldiers, every tree line could conceal a bunker, every rice paddy dike could be a firing position. The Marines advanced using fire and movement, one team providing covering fire while another team moved forward, then switching roles. It was slow, exhausting work in heat that reached over 100 degrees. The VC fought with a combination of guerrilla tactics and conventional defensive operations. They'd defend a position until American firepower became overwhelming, then retreat through tunnels or covered routes to the next prepared position. They used snipers to slow Marine advances, forcing the Americans to clear every possible hiding spot before moving forward. They set booby traps and mines that caused casualties, and made every step potentially deadly. And when they saw opportunities, they counterattacked, using terrain and surprise to hit Marine units that were momentarily vulnerable or isolated. One such counterattack hit Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines on the afternoon of August 19th. Gulf Company had been clearing the village of Nam Yen 3 when approximately 200 VC soldiers launched a coordinated assault on their position from three directions. The VC used the same L-shaped ambush tactics they'd perfected over years of fighting the French and the South Vietnamese. They hit Gulf Company hard, getting inside the Marine perimeter before the Americans could fully respond. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places, Marines and VC soldiers grappling in trenches and buildings, firing at point-blank range. Gulf Company held. They called in artillery danger close, meaning rounds landing within 600 meters of their own position. They used grenades and rifle fire to push the VC back. Marine F-4 Phantom jets made strafing runs so close to Gulf Company's positions that the pilots could see individual Marines waving at them. After 2 hours of continuous fighting, the VC assault broke. Gulf Company counted 65 VC bodies around their perimeter. They'd lost 11 Marines killed and 29 wounded. It was the single bloodiest engagement of Operation Starlite for the Marines, but it was also proof that even when outnumbered and surprised, well-trained Marines could hold their ground against main force VC units. The combination of aggressive patrolling, overwhelming firepower and small unit tactics was grinding down the VC 1st Regiment. By the evening of August 19th, Marine intelligence estimated the VC had lost between 400 and 500 fighters killed. The regiment's command structure was disrupted. Their supply caches were being overrun, and most importantly, the Marines had cut off most escape routes. The VC were trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket, taking casualties from artillery, airstrikes, and direct combat. The question was whether they would stand and fight to destruction or find a way to break out. The VC chose to break out. On the night of August 19th to 20th, large groups of VC soldiers attempted to infiltrate, through Marine lines under cover of darkness. Some succeeded, escaping to the west and south in small groups. Others ran into Marine ambushes and were killed or scattered. By dawn on August 20th, it was clear that the VC 1st Regiment had fractured. Some elements were still fighting in isolated pockets, others had escaped. The cohesive regimental organisation no longer existed. The Marines spent the next 3 days, August 20th through 22nd, conducting clearing operations. This meant systematically searching every village, every building, every tunnel and bunker in the operational area. They found weapons caches, documents, medical supplies, and bodies. They captured VC soldiers who were wounded or too exhausted to escape. They blew up fortifications and tunnel systems, and they continued taking casualties from snipers, booby traps, and small VC units that fought rearguard actions to cover the retreat of their comrades. The final casualty count told the story. 45 Marines killed in action, over 200 wounded. Against that, the Marines claimed 614 VC killed, confirmed by body count, another 66 VC captured, and extensive quantities of weapons and supplies seized or destroyed. By any conventional measure, Operation Starlite was an overwhelming tactical victory. The Marines had found a main force VC regiment, fixed it in place, and destroyed it as an effective combat unit. The VC 1st Regiment would need months to rebuild and would never again threaten Chu Lai the way it had in August 1965. But the operation also revealed problems that would plague American forces throughout the war. The most significant issue was that despite achieving surprise with the timing of the operation, the Marines didn't achieve tactical surprise. The VC knew the Americans were coming, or at least suspected it strongly enough to prepare defences and position forces accordingly. This suggested that American operational security was compromised, either through VC intelligence networks among South Vietnamese allies or through simple observation of American preparations. Large-scale operations involving thousands of troops, dozens of helicopters, and naval vessels offshore were hard to hide. The second problem was that even when surrounded, the VC managed to escape. The encirclement was never complete. Gaps existed in the Marine lines, and the VC exploited them. This would become a recurring pattern. American forces would conduct large operations, inflict heavy casualties, and claim victory, but significant portions of enemy forces would escape to fight again. The fluid nature of the battlefield, the lack of clear front lines, and the VC's superior knowledge of terrain made complete encirclement almost impossible. The third problem was the difficulty of clearing fortified positions in close terrain. The VC's extensive use of bunkers, tunnels, and spider holes made every village a potential fortress. American firepower advantages meant less when the enemy was dug in, and when collateral damage to civilians and property was a concern. The Marines learned quickly that clearing fortified villages was slow, dangerous work that couldn't be rushed no matter how much supporting arms you had available. The fourth problem was casualties. 45 Marines killed might seem acceptable when balanced against 614 VC killed, a kill ratio of about 13-1. But the Marines had to bring their killed and wounded home. Every American casualty generated media attention, congressional questions, and public concern. the VC could accept high casualty rates as the cost of resistance. The American public couldn't sustain high casualty rates indefinitely, especially if the strategic purpose of the casualties wasn't clear. Operation Starlite was successful, but could the United States afford that kind of success repeatedly over years? Despite these problems, Operation Starlite was genuinely significant. It proved that American forces could conduct complex combined operations, coordinate air, naval, and ground assets, and defeat main force VC units in sustained combat. It demonstrated that Marines' small unit tactics and leadership were effective even when things went wrong. And it showed the VC that they couldn't mass their forces near American bases without risking destruction. For the rest of 1965 and into 1966, VC main force units would be more cautious about concentrating, more willing to break contact when faced with large American formations, and less likely to defend fixed positions when they could avoid it. The individual awards from Operation Starlite reflected the intensity of the fighting. 3 Marines received the Medal of Honor for actions during the operation. Corporal Robert O'Malley for his assault on the machine gun position at Landing Zone Blue, Staff Sergeant Harvey Barnum Jr., who led a relief force to rescue a surrounded unit and called in artillery fire while wounded, and Private First Class Joe Paul, who sacrificed his life throwing himself on a grenade to save fellow Marines. Dozens more received the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and Bronze Star for heroism under fire. The Vietnamese perspective on Operation Starlite is harder to assess because VC records from that period are incomplete or were destroyed. What's clear from captured documents and post-war accounts is that the VC 1st Regiment was genuinely surprised by the scale and speed of the American response. They'd expected increased patrols and maybe a company or battalion-sized operation. They didn't expect a full regimental assault from 3 directions simultaneously. The VC also didn't expect the level of firepower the Americans could bring to bear: artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes on a scale that the VC had never experienced before. The survivors of the 1st Regiment reported significant losses and acknowledged that they'd been defeated, at least temporarily. But the VC also learned from Starlite. They learned not to concentrate large forces within range of American bases. They learned to prepare better escape routes and fallback positions. They learned to fight at close range where American firepower advantages were reduced. And they learned that despite American technological superiority, individual VC soldiers fighting from prepared positions could inflict serious casualties on attacking Marines. These lessons would be applied throughout the war. Operation Starlite officially ended on August 24, 1965. The Marines pulled back to Chu Lai and to their other bases. The villages on the Tuong Peninsula were left largely empty, the population having fled during the fighting. Some would return, others would relocate to refugee camps or government-controlled areas. The VC would eventually return too, rebuilding their presence in areas the Marines couldn't permanently occupy. The pattern of American forces conducting operations, inflicting casualties, withdrawing, and then seeing the VC return would repeat itself countless times over the next 8 years. But in August 1965, Operation Starlite felt like a clear victory. The press coverage was largely positive. American forces had proven they could fight and win. The Marine Corps had validated its doctrine and its training. General Westmoreland used Starlite as evidence that his strategy of aggressive search and destroy operations could work. And back in Washington, the operation helped justify the continued build-up of American forces in Vietnam. If one regiment could destroy a VC regiment, then 2 divisions could destroy multiple VC divisions. The logic seemed sound. More troops meant more operations like Starlite, which meant more VC units destroyed, which eventually meant victory. The problem with that logic was that it assumed the VC and North Vietnamese would fight the kind of war Americans wanted to fight: stand and fight, accept battle, trade casualties in conventional engagements where American firepower would dominate. But the VC were fighting a different war. They were fighting for time, trading space for time, accepting casualties when necessary but avoiding decisive battles when possible, waiting for American public opinion to turn against the war, waiting for American political will to collapse. Operation Starlite might have destroyed the 1st VC Regiment as an effective fighting force in August 1965, but by 1966 the regiment would be rebuilt, and by 1967 it would be fighting again. Because the VC had reinforcements, a steady supply of recruits from North Vietnam and from villages throughout South Vietnam. and they had time. The Marines who fought at Starlite didn't think about the long-term strategic implications. They thought about surviving the next firefight, getting their wounded evacuated, completing their mission, and getting back to base. For them, Starlite was successful because they'd done what they were told to do. They'd defeated the enemy in front of them, and most of them had survived to fight another day. The doubts about whether tactical victories like Starlite would lead to strategic victory would come later, as the war dragged on and operations like Starlite became routine rather than exceptional. One Marine Rifle platoon commander wrote in his diary after Starlite that the operation proved American forces could win any battle they wanted to win. The question he couldn't answer was how many battles would be enough. Would it take 10 operations like Starlite, 100, 1,000? And even if American forces won every battle, was that enough to win the war? He didn't have answers in August 1965. Neither did his commanding officers. Neither did anyone in Washington. They just knew that Starlite had worked, that American forces had proven themselves in combat, and that the war would continue. 55 years later, Operation Starlite is mostly forgotten, except by Marines who study their Corps' history and by Vietnam veterans who served in the Corps during 1965. It doesn't have the name recognition of Ia Drang Valley, which happened 3 months later and became famous through the book and movie We Were Soldiers. It doesn't have the controversy of My Lai or the scale of the Tet Offensive. It's just the first major American ground operation in Vietnam, a tactical victory that set the pattern for hundreds of similar operations over the next 8 years. But Starlite matters because it was first. It was the moment when American ground forces transitioned from defensive security missions to offensive combat operations. It was the moment when the United States fully committed to fighting a ground war in Vietnam, rather than just advising and supporting South Vietnamese forces, and it was the moment when both the Americans and the Viet Cong learned what kind of war this was going to be. A war of small unit actions, heavy casualties, tactical victories without strategic resolution, and grinding attrition that would test the will of both sides. For the 45 Marines who died during Operation Starlite, it was the end of their war and the end of their lives. For the 200 plus who were wounded, it was the first time they'd seen combat, or the first time they'd been seriously hurt. Many would recover and return to duty. Some would be medically retired. All would carry the memories of those 6 days for the rest of their lives. For the VC fighters who died, they were casualties in a war they believed was defending their country from foreign invaders. For the VC who survived, Starlite was a defeat but not the end. They would regroup, rebuild, and fight again. And for the American public watching from home, Operation Starlite was a television news story that lasted a few days and then disappeared beneath other news. 45 dead in exchange for 600 enemy killed seemed like an acceptable price in August 1965. But as the months turned to years and the casualties accumulated, the question of what price was acceptable would become harder to answer. Operation Starlite was America's first major victory in Vietnam, but victory in a single battle doesn't win a war. And as the Marines who fought at Starlite would learn over the next years, winning battles in Vietnam was the easy part. Figuring out what those battlefield victories were supposed to accomplish strategically was much harder. Operation Starlite proved that American forces could find, fix, and destroy enemy units. What it couldn't prove was whether that would be enough to win the war. And in the end, it wasn't.